Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right. Hey guys, ready? Ready to go? So this is the second video in this series. I'll be reacting to all four eventually. Let's do it. I recommend watching the first episode, but of course that is up to you. Original link top of the description to Sarcasmatron. A short history of the war in Donbas 2014 to 2022. Okay, guys like you are in what we call the reality-based community. You believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. Judicious study of... That's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Jesus. Anonymous White House aide, allegedly Karl Rove, 2004. Karl Rove is definitely a familiar name, but I forget what his position was.
Where things stand today. So let me be clear on where things stand today. First, conflict is not inevitable. There is still time and space for diplomacy. The United States, in lockstep with our allies and partners, has offered Russia a path away from crisis and toward greater security.
The weird thing about the reaction to the buildup for this current war wasn't so much the skepticism that it was going to happen. There are lots of good reasons to be skeptical. Really, it was the obnoxiously smug but weirdly angry and aggrieved way in which all that skepticism was expressed. I mean, in this instance, America wasn't really asking anyone to take their word for it. Their analysis was based on satellite photography that everyone had access to. You could simply look up the photos yourself and be like, yep, that's a bunch of tanks parked on the border, or yep, that's a bunch of landing ships from the Baltic Fleet suddenly traveling through the Bosphorus. If this was a bluff, it was the most elaborate bluff in the history of...
I feel like we're entering... I'm going to go back 10 seconds just to make sure I don't miss anything. I feel like we are entering an era, and I've said this in a few other videos in the past, where I call it, I don't know if there's a pre-existing term for it, but I call it the post-World War II era, where the United States can't just rely on some external vision of the reality of the United States as acting as some sort of good guy and with the intentions of caring about how the world works. And we're entering past that era into an era where the United States has to justify its power to a world that no longer thinks that they're just some protector of post-World War II global stability. Does that make sense?
Or, yep, that's a bunch of landing ships from the Baltic Fleet suddenly traveling through the Bosphorus. If this was a bluff, it was the most elaborate bluff in the history of warfare. And yet...
What is the evidence that they play? I mean, this is like crisis actors, really? This is like Alex Jones territory you're getting.
In Washington, the territorial integrity of the United States means precisely nothing. Walls are racist. We're a nation of immigrants. But the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that is something we must fight for.
What we know, Matt, is what I've just said, that they have engaged in this activity, in this planning activity. But let me because obviously,
you know, like they have, like remember when Colin Powell held up their thing? They have sarin gas. They have these chemicals.
Hitler invaded countries based on Germanic ties at first. Yeah, dude. Talk to me when he's fucking throwing Ukrainians in a fucking. What are you talking about? Talk to me when he's throwing Ukrainians at a concentration camp. Okay, Hitler wasn't fucking bad because he decided to invade Austria. He was bad because he was fucking killing Jews. Okay, that was the problem.
Hassan. Well, Hassan Piker is acting like you can't be both. So
He wasn't like, oh yeah, we're gonna fucking annex territory with like Germanic people in it. That wasn't the main problem with Hitler, I think.
This is not.
No, it was the original problem with Hitler. It's just that he also committed the he also saw the Holocaust go through. So it's not like they're mutually exclusive.
Not detached skepticism. This is
Main problem with Hitler, I think.
This is not detached skepticism. This is an emotional investment in defending a much larger worldview.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you see people blaming this on the far left, or tankies, quote unquote, or sometimes you see people saying this is a matter of horseshoe theory, blaming the far left and the far right.
None of us get.
This is a giant issue I have with people who are completely anti-USA, which is no problem I have, okay? You can definitely be anti-USA and not have someone like me call you out as something wrong. But as soon as you appear to just be anti-USA and also not care about when anti-USA actors also commit horrible acts are also wrong, if you don't also say that, then I think that you are not objective. You just use any global conflict and political reality as something to further your objective, and anything that might go against your objective, you don't call out. So
Give a damn about Ukraine. Remember,
Left and the far
Jordan
right.
Peterson.
none of us give a damn about Ukraine. Remember the Holodomor? Do you even know what it was?
But look at who is actually peddling this story. One of the big pushers of
What?
Russian propaganda was Nation magazine, which has never been particularly radical. Matt Taibbi is a centrist left liberal. Peter Hitchens is center right. I don't think The Guardian is anyone's idea of revolutionaries. And Glenn Greenwald is whatever Glenn Greenwald is. This is a pan-ideological phenomenon, and it's a relatively recent one. You didn't see this even as late as 2012. It all started in 2014 with Russia's decision to invade the southeast of Ukraine, also known as the Donbas. After Crimea, the political divide in Ukraine started to shift from a linguistic or regional divide into a generation gap among Russian speakers, because young people were getting their news about the Maidan from their friends or the internet, whereas older people were getting it from Russian language cable news. And according to Russian cable news, the Maidan was the start of a neo-Nazi anti-Russian genocide. In reality, the new government was mostly made up of members from Yulia Tymoshenko's party, with Yulia's longtime second-in-command, Alexander Turchinov, as president, and the young technocrat Arseny Yatsenyuk as prime minister. But it didn't really matter how innocuous the new regime was, since they were still appointed rather than elected in the aftermath of a dubious impeachment process. So their promises to address Russian speakers' concerns mostly fell on deaf ears. This was in part because increasingly Russia was aiding the anti-government protests by paying people to show up and busing people in from across the border. And so the former Maidan protesters, scared that the protests might be a front for a new Russian invasion, became counter-protesters. So instead of bringing a new dawn, the revolution of dignity at first just brought more street fights. This time with police on the sideline, while liberals and ultranationalists fought paid thugs and pensioner cable news junkies, fighting not over any actual policy, but rather over completely hypothetical ones. And the Western media was generally happy to repeat Russia's story about this being a spontaneous, natural, ethnic conflict inside Ukraine.
This area that we've been talking about so much, as the general pointed out, they don't really need to go into this area because it's so heavily Russian anyway. It's a problem for Western Ukraine. The Russians don't have to go in.
Namely because that's how it worked in the Balkans, and that was the last time the Western media paid any serious attention to Eastern Europe. Why change paradigms now? In other words, mainland Ukraine looked like a juicy target. But this was not enough to spiral into a civil war, so Russia realized Ukraine was going to need another push, and for the purposes of plausible deniability, they would have to outsource it to a quasi-state actor. So a plan was hatched. Russia organized what was once known in 19th century America as a filibuster, picking volunteers from the Crimean invasion force who were willing to sneak into Donetsk without any government proviso. But what kind of person would volunteer to lead this kind of unit? Igor Strelkov-Girkin was a GRU colonel who had volunteered in Transnistria, fought with the Bosnian Serbs in Visegrad, did wet work in both Chechen wars, and fought in the invasion of Georgia. A big supporter of the movement to reinstate the Tsar and turn Russia back into an absolute monarchy that would rule over all the territory of the former Soviet Union, he got a job as a security official for the billionaire funder of the Russian monarchist movement. It was that billionaire who helped finance his mission to take over Ukraine. Girkin is also an avid war memorabilia collector and historical reenactor for the Russian Civil War, on the white side, of course. Much of what we know about the 2014 invasion of Ukraine comes from his decision to live vlog it on a web forum for enthusiasts of military antiques.
Okay. So, two things here I want to say. One is, again, something I said in the previous video in this series, that if you are the outside power of Russia trying to control Ukraine and eventually invade, or try and manipulate Ukraine into parts of Ukraine into being more pro-Russian, which maybe parts of it were, but that if we're going to play by those rules, then that sets a giant precedent around the world where if you have populations outside of your currently recognized borders that have some of your ethnic citizens, then that belongs to you. And if that's the case, then there's going to be a lot of trouble everywhere. And two is, I'm a little confused where Konstantin Maloviv, who is, again, on the side of the whites in the Russian Civil War, who were against the Soviets. I could sound really stupid here, but that's fine. I could be wrong. The whites were against the Reds, and the Reds were more pro-communist, and the whites were the ones post-Russian imperial Russian monarchy collapse who didn't want to go the communist route, or at least the more direct communist route of the Reds, right? I could be wrong there. My point is, I think will still stand, though, is how is he able to, Russia being known as this power that will easily crush dissidents, how is he able to live in Russia while also claiming to want to return to a more imperial Russian history that was opposed to the communist USSR? And yet he's still there and is able to talk, which is interesting to me and a little confusing.
And he hatched was elegant,
you know what I mean?
If not exactly simple. The train of Ukraine comes from his decision to live vlog it on a web forum for enthusiasts of military antiques. The plan he hatched was elegant, if not exactly simple. The trained special forces would launch a pre-dawn raid on important targets in the cities of the Donbas. They would shoot it out with whoever was guarding the building, either kick out the defenders or hold them hostage, and then invite local compradors who would pretend that they had taken over the building all by themselves, just in time for the journalists to show up a few hours later in the morning. After a few days of chaos caused by the takeovers, during which...
Again, that's a problem with another country not playing by the democratic rules, but knowing that you do play by the democratic rules, and so they'll take it by non-democratic means and then play it off as democratic. Again, giant weakness of non-dictatorship countries that you need to take into account when fighting the more dictatorship-leaning countries, right?
Everyone...
I feel like I'm pausing too much already.
A few hours later in the morning. After a few days of chaos caused by the takeovers, during which everyone in eastern Ukraine would go over to Russia's side, it was assumed, Russia could then send in its army and bloodlessly annex the south and east. Other less organized local groups also captured individual buildings in the big cities like Donetsk and Mariupol, but since they weren't well armed, they were mostly just ignored, and life continued as normal while everyone waited for some kind of negotiation negotiated solution. Girkin, on the other hand, had captured an entire town, a more remote town in the west called Slavyansk. This wouldn't be an important distinction if Russia had just invaded, but instead the Russian army just massed at the border and waited. And waited. The Ukrainian army waited too, both because they were barely functioning and because they were worried a crackdown would provoke a Russian invasion. This created a problem for Slavyansk, because the town was now under the control of a company of men with no authorization, no experience in governance, no preparation, and no real organization. In other words, Slavyansk had been put under martial law by a military with no chain of command. Or if you prefer, one of the first things Girkin did was put in place a people's mayor.
They've now appointed their own mayor, Vyacheslav Ponomaryov, a former soldier in the Soviet army. The town's elected mayor hasn't been seen in public since Friday.
The real mayor had been locked in a basement. The first order of the people's mayor, the pogrom against the local Roma population. The pogrom against the local Roma population.
In the Soviet army. The town's elected mayor hasn't been seen in public since Friday.
The real mayor had been locked in a basement. The first order of the people's mayor, the pogrom against the local Roma population.
Guys, what is pogrom? And were the Roma population pogrom, a violent riot incited with the aim of massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, particularly Jews. So the particularly Jews part isn't applicable here. It's Roma. Okay, so kind of like ethnic cleansing priority here. So I'm assuming the Roma were either just like in the way or were pro-Ukrainian.
В масках были, человек 15, а у них с автоматом, у кого автомат, у кого пистолет, начали простреливать, страх нагонять. Золото, деньги просили.
Then he put out a warning telling people to report any suspicious activity. Activity like speaking Ukrainian. People started disappearing at checkpoints, including journalists and international observers. Some, like the journalist, eventually got released. Others, like an opposition city councilor, were discovered in the local river, disemboweled and bearing signs of torture. This outraged Western Ukraine, but no one in the occupied cities heard about it. The first thing the Russians did in every place they took over was to go after the TV antennas. And so a sort of photon curtain fell between the East and the West, each side living in different realities created by different television diets. So when Ukraine sent in troops, people on the Ukrainian side saw the Russians as having escalated first, and people in the occupied territory saw the Ukrainians as escalating first.
Okay, here's the giant conundrum I have, is that if you are fighting a force that is completely non-democratic, but know that you are beholden to democratic values, and therefore they can use non-democratic means to take control of areas because they can rely on you having to protect democratic means, then they can take advantage of that by making it seem like this is a democratic uprising when in reality it was started by Russia. And so how does the West respond to this without seeming undemocratic themselves and therefore hypocrites? That's an obvious tool that you would use as Russia. How do you respond to that by the USA? Is that a sort of checkmate or check? And if it is a checkmate, then how do you respond to that? Then you have to go to non-democratic means yourself, but then you seem like a hypocrite. What do you do there?
Perceptual in the occupied territory.
Does anyone know what I'm trying to say here? Please give me your thoughts.
We saw the Ukrainians as escalating first. And that difference in perception would become increasingly important. The Russian incursion in the east didn't interrupt the street fighting in western Ukraine, and in Odessa, these clashes escalated to a gun battle that killed 6 pro-Ukraine protesters. The pro-Ukraine side retaliated by marching to the pro-Russian camp to burn it down. The pro-Russian side barricaded themselves into the building next door, and the two groups began shooting and throwing Molotov cocktails at each other. The resulting fire killed 42 people. The fire had been a genuine freak accident. A small fire on the front door barricade spread to the main hallway, where, unbeknownst to almost everyone, there was a generator with a full fuel tank. When that tank caught fire, it formed...
Okay, is that a genuine freak accident? Okay. He said it's a genuine freak accident, but that's like saying you have a boiler that can be affected by fire, and people who were throwing the fire didn't know that, but when they threw the fire, it exploded.
A massive fireball that instantly killed the 40 or so people on the stairs above.
It's like I was throwing firebombs into your house, but I didn't know you had something that would catch fire and explode, and therefore I'm not to be held account for the explosion. That seems a bit ridiculous.
But no massive fireball that instantly killed the 40 or so people on the stairs above. But no one knew any of that at the time, so the Russian media had a field day.
Women and children hid in the trade union's building. First, the armed men set fire to tents, then started throwing Molotov cocktails and grenades at the building. We heard shots fired, saw thick smoke.
There were about 50 of us on the roof, men and women. The right sector was blocking the streets. We looked down at what was happening around us and thought they wouldn't let us out alive. People from other floors were brought down, and the extremists attacked them like a pack of wolves.
At the same time, there were shots from behind the backs of the security forces. Someone was firing a machine gun. We have the empty shells to prove it.
It's all about resources. The oligarchs are behind the scenes, and the fascists are on the front line, and they're just trying to destabilize it and take over resources. We know who's all behind this, and it's the Mossad and the CIA and the British MI6. Let's not kid ourselves, So
while...
Again, another problem is that you'll have a lot of people that aren't even in the country that you're in or the country you're attacking that are just waiting for good reason to believe any of this and then will take the bait. It's another weakness. I'm not saying that democracy is bad. I'm absolutely pro-democracy. I'm saying that a weakness of democracy is that you can't do this. You can't do this without being called out,
In western Ukraine, the shock of the fire calmed things down, as everyone took it as a sign they needed to de-escalate. In the east, the fire was used to convince a large sector of the population that the conflict was existential. So Ukraine turned its attention to the coming presidential election on May 25th, and the separatists began a massive recruitment drive. And not just locals. The neo-Nazi party Russian National Unity formed a legion, the National Bolshevik Party formed a militia, a Chechen militia called the Vostok Battalion was sent, and even people from the West, sucked in by Russian media, joined in. Left-wing Spaniards joined and formed an anti-fascist battalion, where they fought side by side with American and Swedish neo-Nazis. People calling themselves the Don Cossacks.
An anti-fascist party fought with neo-Nazis? What?
With American and...
Did I get that right? Oh, communists and Nazis alike. Okay, sorry.
Joined and formed an anti-fascist battalion, where they fought side by side with American and Swedish neo-Nazis. People calling themselves the Don Cossacks, people calling themselves the Russian Orthodox Army, and an Orthodox Christian Stalinist biker gang called the Night Wolves, all joined the fight. In May, Ukraine elected a new president, Petro Poroshenko. Now, with more legitimacy, the Ukrainian government felt confident enough to try and take back the east by force. But since the separatists had an unlimited supply of captured anti-tank missiles and captured anti-air missiles, the battle would be slow and heavy on artillery, and fought mostly by volunteers with a...
Why would you stand up while firing that? I've never fired a gun in my life, so what the hell do I know? But wouldn't you want to sit down and not leave your entire torso up for being shot?
On artillery.
That doesn't matter. I'm sorry. Who cares?
Captured anti-air missiles, the battle would be slow and heavy on artillery, and fought mostly by volunteers with a few weeks, if any, military training. Volunteers that would later consequently include neo-Nazis. But Ukraine had air power, And while the separatists were occasionally refreshed with more volunteers from Russia, the wave of local volunteers swept up by pro-Russia sentiment never materialized. Girkin couldn't hold on to Slavyansk, and so he delivered an ultimatum to the Kremlin. Send help. Real help, as in an army, or everything would fail. But Moscow was silent. So Girkin took his troops and left.
Дело в том, что блокада Славянска не была полной, и по проселочным дорогам еще можно было выйти. Другое дело, что эти дороги тоже простреливались артиллерией. Точные наши потери при исходе из Славянска уточняются, что они окружат и будут штурмовать наш миллионный Донец. Это, конечно, грустно.
The fall of Slavyansk marked the end of the honeymoon for the Russians, for multiple reasons. Most important was the glimpse it provided of life under Russian occupation.
Sometimes the answer that I hear to this stuff is that ignorance is the enemy, right? Like, populations not knowing the whole story is the enemy. But I'm a little pessimistic towards that view, because I think that people with their political views, they don't need to be unignorant. I think ignorance is an excuse for just wanting certain outcomes. And if you want a certain outcome, you won't care about bad stories that affect that outcome, because it could ruin your chances of your worldview being succeeding. And so I think calling it ignorance is the enemy of this stuff is a little too... I don't even think that's needed for people to believe some stuff. You're going to want to believe certain things and question certain things depending on how they affect your worldview.
When Girkin left,
does that make sense?
Slavyansk, 40 or so people were still disappeared. The assumption was they were all just being held somewhere and would eventually be released. And most were, but not all.
Right now, the authorities are digging up a mass grave site that the separatists used for their dead and possibly the dead of people that they had actually executed. But right now, they want to get the fresh remains out so that they can be identified and so that they can continue their investigation into what they believe was the execution of 4 Protestants who lived in Slavyansk, were locals, and were killed potentially just so that their cars could be taken.
On top of that, the residents of Slavyansk who had rallied to the rebels in April were now rallying to the government.
людей, даже больше половины, что здесь, они поддерживают их до сих пор. Уже сейчас они все молчат. А когда были бандиты, они были герои. А сейчас вот эта половина людей, это половина этих террористов.
Now everybody's accusing each other of being separatists now that the Ukrainians have come here.
It turned out few people in the town actually cared about the Russian world or federalization, but rather had just concluded early on that Russia would invade and wanted to be seen supporting the winning side first. On top of that, the whole propaganda line behind the rebellion was that if Ukraine recaptured territory, there would be a massacre of Russian speakers. When those didn't materialize, the local population realized the fight maybe wasn't so existential. Finally, Girkin's decision to withdraw from Slavyansk split the Russian ultranationalist movement in half. Girkin, sensing the Kremlin was going to betray him, used the opportunity to humiliate the Kremlin, posting that Russia didn't deliver on all the aid it had promised. One half of the ultranationalist movement believed him and blamed the Kremlin. The other half blamed Girkin for being too cowardly to make a last stand. This division culminated in an internet live stream argument between the ex-neo-Nazi self-proclaimed leader of the Donetsk People's Republic and one of the far-right neo-Soviet activists who had been bundling military aid. In the course of this argument, they outlined what had been delivered when and whether it should have been enough to hold the town. And we should pause here, because now would be a good time to note that Russia could still walk away here and leave with everything it could want, minus a little embarrassment. All they'd have to do is order their agents home and claim they had never been involved to begin with. Instead...
Yeah, but then you could allow the pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian belief to expand.
They escalated. Again.
Not every video can be verified, but U.S. officials say that half a dozen times...
Yeah, I'm not going to say that the only risk was a little embarrassment. Also the risk is that now, since you were called out and you were pushed out, the anti-Russian sect of this area in Ukraine could grow, and maybe attacking now would be better than letting that grow and attacking later, you know?
times over the past 2 weeks. Russia has fired barrages.
By the way, if I'm saying anything that's stupid, could be true, just call me out, okay? I'm learning here and giving my opinions, but you know, again, what the hell do I know?
Its own territory
one person
into Ukraine. Shelling, which Russian soldiers have been bragging about on the internet, lasts about a half hour and appears to be aimed at Ukrainian military units fighting the separatist rebels.
Starting on July 11th, the Russian army launched a surprise artillery attack on Ukrainian bases from the Russian side of the border, killing dozens. When that didn't turn the tide, they gave the rebels a more advanced anti-air system. And you probably remember this part of the story.
Hours after the plane crashed, the wreckage was still smoldering in this dark and remote wheat field in eastern Ukraine. An area controlled by armed separatist fighters, an area that has seen intense fighting the last week. This amateur video shows the moment flight MH17 came down.
This is a location where one of the bodies of the victims fell through into the home of a resident of this small town.
The Russians had now killed more civilians in a single shot than Ukraine had in the entire war up to this point. And it was only this that brought the hammer down from the West. Obama had been responding to the annexation of Crimea with mostly symbolic personal sanctions. Now the EU and America were sanctioning major Russian companies. So Russia, now in for a penny, in for a pound, decided to launch a real invasion of Ukraine. About 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers with tanks and IFVs simply rolled into Ukraine, encircled a large chunk of Ukrainian forces, agreed to let them retreat through a humanitarian corridor, then changed their minds and killed everyone inside the pocket with artillery. But a strange thing happened in the face of this massive escalation. No one noticed. Russia had denied they had invaded, and everyone just decided to believe them. When Ukraine and the State Department provided satellite imagery showing Russian tank companies operating in Ukraine, maybe
deciding to believe them, I feel like it's just a way of saying I don't care enough about this area of the world to provoke more tension against Russia. Because saying
it may have provided satellite imagery showing everyone just decided to believe them.
Because deciding to believe them, that's like they did their research and they're like, oh, okay, Russia's correct. That doesn't make any sense.
When Ukraine and the State Department provided satellite imagery showing Russian tank companies operating in Ukraine, maybe it made sense to ignore it and say, well, America lied about Iraq, but it wasn't just the Pentagon presenting evidence for long. Russian soldiers posted on Facebook about being sent and took selfies while on mission. There were also multiple Russian tankers taken prisoner by Ukraine who were also saying in interviews that they had been ordered into the country. The Kremlin said that those Russians fighting in their government-issued kit were just volunteers on their summer break, and the tank crews had simply gotten lost and accidentally driven 50 miles.
Someone who is not held accountable for anything he says that might be a lie, talking to people who are accountable for saying things that are lies. You can't win.
Break, and the tank crews had simply gotten lost and accidentally driven 50 miles into a war zone. And amazingly, America's pro-war industrial military complex, consent manufacturing, imperialist press just decided to take Russia at its word. And that's still how they cover it.
Deciding to take Russia at his word again. No, it's not caring enough to do anything. It's not seeing it as worthy of going in. Not taking them at their word is way too little. It's you didn't care enough about it to do anything, and now you're just saying I took them at their word.
As far as I can tell, the only American publication that dropped the word allegedly when talking about Russian involvement in Ukraine is Vox. There was, however, one group of people who believed Ukraine, Russians.
Десантно-штурмовой бригады Ульяновской. В каком-то месте, он говорит, они попали в засаду, противотанковый миномет. А при попадании в ногу он, естественно, просто сносит напрочь. И здоровый мальчик стал без ноги.
Regular Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine meant Russian soldiers dying. Not volunteers, but professionals under orders, leaving behind bewildered parents and widows. Widows entitled to monetary benefits. But acknowledging these deaths would mean refuting the premise of the war, namely that this is all supposed to be a civil war. Russia probably only thought a handful of people would die, and it would be easy enough to hush it up. But more than 100 died in just the first month. The Kremlin PR machine.
And then you just change it to a war against NATO and America, which, I mean, they are helping Ukraine, but again, how do you win?
Is powerful enough.
How do you win a propaganda war against someone who isn't called out about? I've said it. I keep repeating myself.
But more than 100 died in just the first month. The Kremlin PR machine is powerful enough to spin away any Russian atrocity against Ukrainians, and it could certainly invent fictional Ukrainian atrocities. But what it couldn't do was spin away its own mistreatment of patriotic, duty-bound Russian soldiers and their families, especially when the Kremlin was increasingly relying on ultranationalists as its support base. For the Kremlin, the way out of this paradox was further radicalization. Independent media was shut down and official media became more unhinged. NGOs for war widows were shut down. Government began rewriting history. Boris Nemtsov was murdered. Russia was beginning its lurch from a hybrid regime to a totalitarian one.
А в России все думают в первую очередь о государстве, о единстве русского народа и о том, что Россия окружена империализмом, который их вот-вот раздавит. Ну, как знаете, сейчас страна расколота. Большая часть патриотов и малая часть здравомыслящих людей.
But none of this would help if soldiers kept coming home in body bags. So Russia had to negotiate. And Ukraine had to negotiate because it was defenseless and on its own. America wasn't sending military aid. So Russia agreed to pull its troops out of the country if, in exchange, Russia would give the East more autonomy. And both sides were to pull their artillery away from the front line. And let's stop again, because this was Russia's third off-ramp. It now had a buffer state in the occupied territories, plus everything it had before. And it had thoroughly shown Ukraine who was boss, and it had demonstrated that America was not going to save them. But instead of taking that off-ramp,
Аллах Акбар! Огонь!
Russia launched a new offensive, this time against the Donetsk airport, immediately after signing the ceasefire agreement. And Russia refused to remove its troops on the basis that there had never been any Russian soldiers in Ukraine, so they didn't have to do anything. But Russia still couldn't take any big risk with its own soldiers, so instead it gave the rebels lots and lots of heavy rocket artillery and told them to have at it. The rebels fired this artillery from dense residential neighborhoods, starting an artillery war that destroyed all the towns adjacent to the airport. And after a grueling 3-month fight, in which the rebels were finally able to capture the airport by demolishing it and burying the defenders alive, the entire process of peace negotiation, agreement violation, brutal artillery war, and Russian victory happened a second time. A third attempt to take Mariupol was also launched, but was aborted in favor of a random rocket attack on the city center.
Chaos struck in a matter of minutes, shattering the calm of a wintry Saturday morning in Mariupol. Out of nowhere, rockets slammed into residential neighborhoods, markets, even schools. Bodies lay strewn on the streets.
This massacre, which killed 31 people in one volley, turned the city against the rebels pretty much permanently, and made heroes of the volunteer battalion assigned to defend Mariupol, the now internationally famous Azov Battalion. And finally, it seemed like with 12,000 people dead, Russia would finally take off-ramp number 5. And they did, sort of. Until 2022. And we'll pause here one last time, because it's worth noting that Russia did not win anything of material value in this war. The territory in question is economically crippled, and Ukraine was already ineligible to join NATO. And the war made Ukraine both more militarized and more anti-Russia. But they did win, and win in a way that would be consequential for the world, because
this shows two big things. One is that a peace, again, without having whatever territory that is left to Ukraine in an agreement being fast-tracked into NATO, will just present another opportunity for Putin to wait, get his front line, secure the territory he has, and then strike again, okay? And second, that Putin is relying on certain rules from NATO that don't allow a country that is currently under attack of a non-NATO member, or just anyone, to join NATO. You can't play by Putin's game. He is going to checkmate you. You either have to continue fighting Russia and securing aid to Ukraine to keep fighting Russia, or secure a deal where Russia gets some of the conquered territory in Ukraine and Ukraine gets fast-tracked into NATO. If you don't do that, you're just saying, okay, Russia, you can't have the rest of Ukraine right now, but in a year, 2 years, or 3 years, when you attack again, then you can have Ukraine.
Russia accomplished something in Ukraine that should have been impossible. It invaded and brutalized a neighbor and came out with a better reputation than it had going in. Half the West was more sympathetic to Russia than to Ukraine, let alone the rest of the world. Russia had invaded a country in broad daylight, and most of the world was convinced that it hadn't happened. Or if it had, it was somehow Ukraine.
Not convinced that it hadn't happened. That is ridiculous. They didn't care enough to research it to see if it happened. That is the most infuriating rhetoric, is convinced it didn't happen. No, convinced it didn't happen means that you researched it, looked at what happened, and found out logically it didn't happen. That's not what happened here. It wasn't worth it. That's
Ukraine's fault, because they were Nazis or something. And it's worth marveling at the scope of this accomplishment. Imagine fighting a war against a country so good at gaslighting that half the world is convinced you were at risk of committing genocide against speakers of a language that you speak. And so that begs the question, how did they do this? There are some mundane reasons. For one, Russia's attack on Ukraine
American
happened the same
and European
time as the rise of
bluffs.
ISIS. The month the war heated up in Slavyansk was the month ISIS conquered Mosul.
Interesting.
And the week Russia invaded for real was the same week ISIS released the tape of James Foley being beheaded. Also, there wasn't really much effort by the West to push back, since both Europe and the White House were convinced this was a situation that needed to be de-escalated rather than a case of Russia acting opportunistically. Really, they just wanted it to go away as fast as possible. And there was also Russia's tactical approach, which was dubbed hybrid warfare in the West and became the subject of much discussion in the Pentagon. Hybrid warfare is the idea of a war that combines regular war, terrorism, cyber war, propaganda, and other stuff.
In other words, taking advantage of countries that have to follow democratic rulings sometimes.
Russia's war on Ukraine certainly involved terrorism. They bombed dozens of civilian targets in western Ukraine at the same time as the regular war, and that bombing campaign later expanded to NATO territory. And it certainly involved cyber war. Russia brought down the power grid, and countless institutions got hacked. But the effect of both was marginal at best on the outcome. I suspect the real magic behind Russia's information war was not that it really succeeded in hiding Russian crimes, but how it distorted time. By broadening the gap between when something happened and when Western media could finally be forced to report it had happened, sequences of events could be presented out of order. Russia could act aggressively, trigger Ukrainian retaliation, present that retaliation as if it were unprovoked, and then a week later, when Russia's initial act of aggression was reported, Russia could just present it as retaliation for what the Ukrainians had done first. It didn't matter at that point what had actually occurred first, because no one in the West was paying enough attention. So an invasion of Crimea that started on February 24th could be presented as retaliation for the formation of a fascist junta that hadn't been appointed to government until February 27th. And so Russia could fire artillery from dense residential neighborhoods and then call it an atrocity when the Ukrainians fired back. And Russia could point the finger at Ukraine for not following the Minsk agreements after it launched 3 massive bloody offensives immediately after signing the Minsk agreement. And the fucking Gravel Institute can present a war in 2014 as having been provoked by a law.
Eastern Ukrainians were horrified at what they saw as a far-right seizure of power, with veneration of Bandera and elimination of equal recognition for languages like Russian.
Service industry workers have since January been obliged to talk to customers in Ukrainian unless clients specifically ask to switch.
That wasn't passed until 2019. And this, of course, had a multiplying effect on populists, because the mainstream media coverage, which was already hopelessly biased in favor of Russia, was assumed by anti-establishment types to be biased in favor of Ukraine, because that was, at least nominally, the side America had taken. And so populists took even more extreme anti-Ukraine positions to compensate for the pro-Ukraine media bias they were sure they were reading. But I still don't find any of these reasons totally convincing. And of course, none of this explains why Russia 8 years later decided to launch a full-scale war in which it had nothing to gain and could not win. So, coming up in part 3, we'll talk about what some of the most intelligent intelligent and well-respected theorists think about the war.
The West is principally responsible for this mess, not the Russians. Just think about that word, coup. Orange Revolution, promoting democracy, the coup, February 22nd.
And why they're all fucking wrong. And now I would like to thank my patrons.
Okay. Great video, once again. This is the second video of 4 videos in the series. I'll watch the next 2. Really, I just want to say, before I give my last comments, before ending my reaction here, fantastic videos. They're both, even if you don't know a lot, it educates you in a way that keeps your attention. I'm not the greatest learner. I like to learn things, but it's being presented in a way that is really helping me. So I want to say great job to Sarcasmatron for a great video so far. Secondly, just my closing statements here. The saddest reality that I understand growing up and just looking at other people, I'm sure I'm guilty of this myself, but I try and hold back. I don't really have a solid world opinion, world geopolitical opinion, okay? I try to learn more. Of course, I am vulnerable to some propaganda or some things as anyone else. But the fact that I've learned that even adults, very old people who are even smart in some areas, can be so easily influenced by information that helps their worldview, and then present that information is horrifying, and it's very depressing to me that people can just, even very well-educated people, can just, if they have a solid worldview, people will take in information that will help that worldview with not much corroboration or sourcing. So much easier, where any information that has a lot of sourcing but goes against their worldview will reject and question it. This goes, I am not calling out any side of the aisle for this. This is just a fact that I've learned about people as I've grown up and see how people react to certain political ideas and political news stories, right? Is that I can't believe how vulnerable people are to accepting things that help their pre-existing idea of the world and pre-existing idea of how they want the world to be. And I see that in the war in Ukraine, Ukraine against Ukraine and Russia, the war in Israel and Palestine against each other. But I'm dumbfounded, and I realize it now. I've only really started paying attention to politics in like 2016, and only in the past 4 or 5 years it's really been trying to learn about it. But that is the scariest thing that I've realized, is how vulnerable people are to certain things that just help their pre-existing idea. People don't want to be wrong, and anything that could be wrong, it's like, give me the sources. Where are the sources? Are you sure about this? This could just be propaganda, right? But if it's something that is even less corroborated than the thing they're fighting against, but it goes for their idea, then it's like, oh, probably true. Oh, probably true. But if there's something that is against their idea, but is more fact-checked than the thing they just called probably true, they'll be like, hold on, wait, do we know this? And that is just so depressing to me. Fantastic video, guys. I'm one person who is learning. If I said anything you disagree with, call me out in the comments, please, as always. Hope everyone is doing well. I love learning with you guys. I look forward to seeing any comments, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.